Okay, welcome back to It's Not a Sport. We're doing something a little bit different here. We're doing a live stream. I used to do live streams of the podcast and then upload the VOD to the channel back in the day. This was back in, I would say, like season one or two ish, like really long time ago. But now, since I've been experimenting a lot more, as you can see, with the content on the channel, we are trying it again, a live stream, this time on YouTube, not Twitch, because also I think YouTube's pushing, like, would push live streams and would push shorts. And I think it's a good way for the sort of content that I'm about to do, which is the game design breakdown videos. So if you don't know, I did 2 game design breakdown videos earlier last year talking about fighting games and talking about, where are they? Guilty Gear Strive. Yes, these are the 2. So fighting game 1. And I really like this series because it's more game design oriented. It's more focused on that sort of content, and it really goes in depth about uh, systems and mechanics and how they operate within the game and just things like that. So I wanted to do it in a live stream format because these videos can get very technical and can go for a very long time. I thought that it would be better to do it in a live stream format, just all in one go, than trying to do a pre-recorded video and it going on for like an hour, because I don't think anyone's going to watch that. And this is probably more a better way of doing it. So here we go. Let's talk about it. What game are we breaking down? Well, we're breaking down Magic the Gathering. So I came up with this entire list, kind of going over the core mechanics of the game. I think that Magic is a very, very complex game. It's been around forever, since the 90s. It has mechanics on top of mechanics on top of mechanics, and whole different crazy interactions that you could do with the game. And I think it's a must play game if you want to become a game designer. It is a game that you should play to fundamentally understand just how mechanics can operate, how tempos within games can operate, and a lot of concepts that are in Magic apply to other games such as League of Legends, StarCraft, uh, Valorant, any other type of these games. And it's relatively easy to get into and understand as well. So, what is Magic the Gathering? Well, it is a trading card game. It is at its core a gacha game. If you don't really know what a trading card game is, it's you collect cards by opening packs. You go to your local store, your Target or whatever, you open packs and you get cards, and you use these cards to make a deck of cards in order to play the game. At its core, Magic the Gathering is probably the original gacha game, or one of the original gacha games. Funny enough, if you think about it like that. Um, but it is a trading card game. So that is the genre that Magic the Gathering falls under. So let's get into now some of the technical things here. You can see on the screen that I have a list of things that we're going to go over and talk about. I will probably try and add timestamps so that later on in the VOD you could just skip to these parts like I did with the previous game design videos. So yeah, skip to whatever part you deem worthy, or if you just are a completely new person and you want to learn the game, this is also a great video for you. So the win slash lose con of Magic the Gathering. So the win slash lose con, there are multiple ways to win the game and lose the game depending on, your deck and your strategy within the game. But the most simplest ways of winning and losing the game are players reach 0 health, or they have no more cards left in their library to draw. So we're going to go over those terms a little bit later. But basically, every player in Magic the Gathering starts with 20 health, and you do attacks with creatures or other spells to damage your opponent. And once they get down to 0 health, they lose. There's again mechanics that can negate this and can change the rule set of this rule, but that is the first fundamental win slash lose con, is you lose health. The second one is a major one that I would say is your library. So each turn you draw a card, And once you're out of turn or cards to draw, if you can't draw any more cards, you lose the game. So those are the two big major ones. Again, quick reminder, Magic the Gathering is a super complex game, and well, there's rules that change these rules. And you'll learn those the more you play it, the more you go into it. So let's talk about kind of the first thing that players should understand, because it is the thing that kind of drives Magic. It's the color pie. And I think the color pie, most players will not think about this as time goes on, but the color pie is sort of the identity of each type of deck, an archetype of deck that you will make, and what cards kind of fit within that archetype. So Magic the Gathering works off of a energy slash land system, meaning you need certain amount of energy and a certain color of energy in order to play your spells, your cards, your monsters, your creatures. That's its resource system. And the resource system is the first thing that you kind of think about when you're building a deck. So this is an image that we have of the color pie. The 5 colors are black, blue, white, green, and red. Black, you'll find, deals with a lot of death and decay. It's kind of the dark color, right? So you'll find a lot of zombies within this type of archetype of the color pie, or you'll find a lot of revival spells, or a lot of just instant removal, which means it just kills you spells. Like there's literally a spell called Murder. I'm sure that you can understand what Murder does. It kills a creature, or kills a player, or not a player, but a creature. We'll talk about creatures again later. Blue is more like water. It's more control-y. It's more slow. So the blue is a color that lets you, draw more cards. It lets you stop, counter people's playing cards. It's really slow down the game. That's more of its intelligent magic. That's what blue goes into. White, as you can see, it's like order and peace. They're a little bit more creature oriented. They're close to blue. They do some things that blue does. All these colors kind of cross into each other one shape or another. But white is kind of the opposite of black. It deals with more life. It has a lot of life gain, which makes you go past your 20 life, so you go to 21. It deals with order and peace. You'll find like angels in this archetype a lot. So that's kind of white. Green, of course, is more nature-based. It's very deals with the forest. You play really big creatures in green. Dinosaurs are in green. Big woolly mammoths. Tree people. Lord of the Rings sort of a deal like that. It deals with fighting, so creatures are fighting each other. It's very, very nature-oriented. You'll find elves in green, and that's kind of the nature of green. And red, fire, is chaotic. It's impulsive. You'll deal a lot of it's a lot of small fast creatures that do damage. You'll find like lava monsters, or like creatures that just want to beat you down as fast as possible. You'll have spells that will do a lot of damage to your face, or do small amount of damage to your face, and that's really red. So you can really think of it that like whatever color relates to like some sort of piece in nature is probably the best way to describe it. And you'll really start to, when you play the game, you'll think about these colors, think about what color, what type of player am I, and you'll really start to explore these colors a bit more, I think. So when I first started, I was a dinosaur. My first deck was a dinosaur deck, which fell into green a lot. But then they also had a lot of colors in red because it was fast, it was chaotic. It's dinosaurs; they're going everywhere. So my first deck was a green-red deck. Later on, I kind of discovered that I lean actually kind of in the opposite direction, more into blue and more into black, where I like to slow down the game and stop and kill creatures at the same time. So color pie is really, really important to understanding Magic. Eventually, they all kind of merge into each other, cross into each other, but they all have their own sort of mechanics and identity, and that's maybe the first thing that you want to learn about. And the color pie goes into our mana system. Again, like I said, lands. So here we have your basic land types. You have white, you have blue, you have red, and you have green, which they're called a plains land, island land, a swamp land, a mountain, and a forest. Like I said, really has to do with nature. The whole thing with Magic Gathering is that you are on planes, the world, the earth, different universes, and you tap mana, which is lands from the earth to cast your spells. That's the whole like lore identity of Magic the Gathering. So that's why there's land cards. The land cards, of course, again, cross, as we can see that they go down a little bit in this second row here, where you have black red lands, green white lands, red green lands, blue green lands, and these also then will tap for one of the colors of mana that are in the game. So understanding lands, understanding kind of what type of color identity you want to go is really important for the game and your identity as a player. And then we have colorless lands. And these are lands that don't tap for any sort of color or any mana. So they just generally you can spend them on anything that is color that doesn't require color mana, right? So and they're generally fall under the archetype of utility lands too, that will do some sort of special thing when activated. They're not just there for mana. So lands, that pretty much covers lands and mana. So what do we use mana and lands for? Well, we use them to cast our spells. So here we have all types of spells. So the first row I have is creatures. Creatures are your main kind of way to go on defense and offense in this game. So the first one is Avalanche, Angel of Hope. Sorry, I'm like speaking really fast. She cost 5 mana. I can zoom in here for you. She costs 5 mana of no color and 3 white. So she's a very expensive card. She's a very big payoff. She has a little bit of subtext, as you can see at the very bottom is kind of like a lore, and you have what ability she has. So let's go over kind of what your basic creature card will look like, and we'll go play the game. We'll talk about other creatures more over in the future. So bear with me here. So right here at the top is her name, and then on the right is her mana cost. And you need lands, and you need to play the lands and tap it, which just means kind of turn it side to side. And that's how you tap out mana in order to cast this spell. So again, you need 5 of any color and 3 white in order to cast this spell. She is a legendary creature, as we see here. Legendary means that there is a special rule that is applied with this creature. We'll talk about that a little bit later. She is a creature to indicate that yes, she is a creature. She is of type angel, so she is a angel, where the dragon on the right is a dragon avatar, and the one on the next to it is an Eldrazi. So these are their creature types. This indicates what type of creature they are, whether they're human, angel, zombie, dragon, dwarf, elf, anything that you can think of. That's where it's going to indicate it, right? And then right there, the little symbol on the right of it is its rarity. Each card will have its own rarity, and generally the symbol will look different because of the set that the card comes out of. But the color itself will indicate what rarity it is. So this is mythic. This is the highest rarity, and the dragon is a rare, which is under that. And then you have your commons and then your uncommons. So underneath her legendary creature type, angel, we have her abilities. What does this creature do? Okay, so it is flying, it is vigilant, and it is indestructible. Ignore those for now. We'll talk about mechanics a little bit later, but those are its main mechanics. And then it has its special ability. Other permanents you control have indestructible. So it gives other creatures or other things that you have on your field indestructible. Cool. Dragon, for example, it has flying. We've seen that before in the angel, and it has if you pay 2 mana, as we see here, Search your library for a dragon permanent card and put it into your graveyard. If you do, this card, Scions of the Ur-Dragon, that's the name of the card, becomes a copy of that card until the end of turn, then shuffle your library. So you're probably thinking, like, what the fuck does that mean? You know, that's a lot of text. And again, as you start playing the game, you'll start to understand it a little bit more. These are the cards that are very on the high end, and they're going to do a lot of things. But to put it in layman's terms, basically, you pay 2 mana, you search your library for any dragon card in it, and you put it into your graveyard. We'll talk about that later. If you do so, then that becomes a copy, or this card, Scion of Dragon, becomes a copy of the card that you put into your graveyard until the end of your turn, and then it reshuffles your library. So those are creature cards. Last major thing about creature cards is down in the bottom right corner, you'll see these numbers. These are its life and its toughness, or its damage and its toughness, excuse me. So it has 8 damage. So the angel has 8 damage and 8 health. What does that mean? Well, when it attacks either player or another creature, it will do 8 damage to that creature. And if it goes under 8 health, it will die and go to the graveyard. That's the simplest way of doing it. Health is not it regenerates at the end of turn. So let's say the creature takes 4 damage. Well, then it'll do 8 damage and have 4 life left. And then once it's the end of the turn, it will regenerate back to an 8/8. So that's how to kind of determine like the stats of the creature, is how strong it is. So that's creature cards in a nutshell. These are probably very high end, more complicated creatures, but let's go into our next genre of cards or permanents, which are sorcery cards. So sorcery cards are your big spells, you can say, right? They're crazy spells that kind of change the flow of the game. They are usually a one-time use, and sorceries you can only use on your turn. So sorceries, let's go over the one on the right. Damned, right, is costs 8 black mana. As we can see, it is a sorcery. We can see its rarity is rare. And what does it do? Well, it destroys a target creature. A creature destroyed this way cannot be regenerated. And then has another special ability called Overload on it. So that's what Damn does, is essentially it is what we call the removal spell. Remember, we talked about the color pie, we talked about black, what it wanted to do. Kill creatures. Damn just kills a creature and it can't come back. Then we have the ultimatums, which are really, really big payoff sorceries in decks on the right. As we can see, Ruinous Ultimatum, which costs 2 red, 3 white, and 2 black. Very expensive card, right? Destroys all non-land permanents opponent controls. So it just completely destroys everything that the opponent has that is not a land. So that's a pretty big payoff right there. Eerie Ultimatum, same thing. 2 whites, 3 blacks, 2 greens. Return any number of permanent cards with a different name from your graveyard to the battlefield. So if you have a lot of big, crazy creatures in your graveyard, now they go back straight into the battlefield. And that's sorcery cards. Very simple. Next are instants. And instants are they're similar to sorcery cards, but they can be played whenever. So instants can be played on your opponent's turn or within different phases of the game. So an instance, for example, this one, Giant Growth, costs 1 green mana. Target creature gets 3/3 until end of turn. It's 3 damage, or 3 more damage, and 3 more health until the end of turn. And these are just different versions of Giant's Growth or art. So again, we'll be going over more examples a little bit later, but those are instants. And then lastly are enchantments. And enchantments generally go on the battlefield, and they generally stick around on the battlefield. Enchantments can again be cross type, as we see here, where these are enchanted creatures for the first 2. So let's look at Heliod Suncrown, the one in the middle. It costs 2 of any color and 1 white. It is a legendary enchantment creature, god. As we can see, it has a rarity of mythic, and its abilities or subtext is it's indestructible. And as long as you have a devotion to white, is as long as your devotion to white is less than 5, Herald Heliod is not a creature. So if you do not have white mana symbols, so creatures that lack white mana symbols on the battlefield, then it's not a creature, it's an enchantment. And what it does is whenever you gain life, put a 1/1 counter on target creature or enchantment you control. So it is a enchantment until you have 5 white symbols, then it becomes a creature. And that's kind of how enchantments work. So Shark Typhoon's probably a more traditional enchantment, I would say, on the right. It is a 6 mana card. It takes 5 of any color and 1 blue. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create an XX blue shark creature token with flying, where X is that spell's converted mana cost. So whenever you cast a spell, let's say you cast Heliod, right? Then it will create a 3/3 creature that is a shark on the battlefield for as long as Shark Typhoon is on your side of the field. And that's what it does. They're permanent. They're kind of like passives, for example, that stay in the field. So anyway, let's take a quick break and recap what we just talked about on the list. We have gone over a lot, and like I've said, this game can be very, very, very complicated, and there's a lot of terms that I'm throwing at you that you may not understand, either as a new player or as a game designer, or maybe you play card games or board games and they kind of, cross into each other. Okay. And this lets me get a sip of water. Okay. So, we talked about the win/lose cons, talked about the color pie, talked about lands. We talked about dual lands, which are the archetype lands where they have 2 colors to it. And in dual lands, you have another subcategory of lands: fetch lands, pain lands, shock lands, bounce lands. These are all dual lands that kind of have special effects to them when you play those lands. For example, a pain land will do 1 damage to you when you play it, right? Shock lands will do 2 damage to you when you play it. We'll go over these examples more once we get in game. We have utility lands that do special things when you activate them, and then there's another type of land called artifact lands, which are generally in very old formats. You won't run into these as much. We talked about mana cost, how to cast your spells and how much they cost. We talked about card types. We talked about creature cards. They have a type of angel, human, dragon, etc. They have an attack and defense. We talked about key abilities, or we didn't talk about key abilities, what they do, but we talked about how they're on there. So the ones that you've seen so far would be indestructible, flying. These are some other ones that you can see on here. Are death touch, defender, double strike, first strike, flash, flying, haste, hexproof, and indestructible. These are the most common types of key abilities you will see. So we're going to be talking about that next. We talked about sorcery cards. We talked about instants. We talked about enchantments. And then we have also key actions, which are the abilities like what the angel does, all permanents, give these creatures indestructible. So, now that we talked about all that, let's talk about key abilities real quick. So, key abilities, you can go to the wiki page, they're all up there, and they all tell you what to do. There's a lot of them. Generally on the card, there's kind of subtext that tells you what they do as a whole. So, for example, we'll talk about flying, right? Because flying is one of the most common ones out there, I would say, and you'll see flying creatures. So, flying, where is it? Here he is, flying. So, what is a flying creature? Flying is an evergreen evasion ability that makes creatures without flying unable to block creatures with flying. That simple. So flying creatures, for example, think about a plane. If you're on the ground, you have a sword. You cannot hit the plane or the bird that is in the air that's flying. They can hit you, but you cannot hit it. So you need another creature that is able to fly in order to hit that creature. It's as simple as that. That's flying. Death touch, what is death touch? Well, death touch, if you get attacked, if any creature interacts with you, it dies. Think of it as the story of the Midas touch, where everything he touches turns to gold. That's death touch. If it touches you, it dies. Defender, this one's less common. You probably won't see it as much, but it's still one that I think you have to note. Defender means that it cannot attack. It is purely a defense card. It cannot attack. Double strike and first strike are kind of complicated because it deals with priority, meaning that if one creature attacks and the other creature blocks, the creature that instead of it going at once like it normally would, the creature that has first strike or double strike goes first, and the defending creature takes damage, and then it goes again. So it kind of just attacks twice. So first strike attacks, first, and double strike attack twice. Flash means that it kind of allows you to cheat the turn system, meaning that if it's not your turn, you can flash the creature in and just play it on one of the steps that you wouldn't be allowed to play a creature on. Flying, we talked about flying. Haste, so in haste means that it can attack immediately after you summon it. Generally, when you summon a creature, you have to wait until the next turn in order for you to use it again. But with haste, you'll just be able to attack immediately. Hexproof means that it's immune to all targeted spells. And indestructible means that it cannot die, essentially. And those are the most common key abilities that you'll see creatures. Again, there are a lot more, and you'll just kind of learn how these go the more you play the game. Colorless artifacts. So what are colorless artifacts, right? So colorless artifacts fall under the category of not having color. So we talked about colorless lands and how they can tap for they don't tap for a certain mana symbol in the color pie. So they don't tap for red, black, green, or blue, or white. Colorless artifacts are basically anything goes. So they tap for example, automatic librarian taps for 3 of any color. And this is a creature artifact. We have vehicle artifacts, we have equipment artifacts, we have artifacts that just are like enchantments. They stay on the field and they just do things. And that's kind of the way to think about it, I think, is that they're enchantments that cheat the color pie. So let's talk about our creature artifact first. It has all the properties of a creature, except it doesn't tap for any mana. And when this automatic library enters the battlefield, it scries 2. Scry, what does Scry 2 does? Well, it tells me on the card right here. It look at the top 2 cards of your library, then put any card of them on the bottom of your library, and the rest on the top in any order. We have a vehicle or artifact vehicle. What is a vehicle? Well, it tells you right at the bottom that a crew tap any number of creatures you control with total power of 1 or more. This vehicle becomes an artifact creature until end of turn. So vehicles are like cars, and they need creatures to activate. We have an artifact equipment. Well, what is it? Equipment. Well, equipment is a sort of like gear that says equipped, pay 2 mana to equip, or equipped to creature gets 2+1. As long as this equipped creature is a legendary, it has trample and haste. So equipment is just gear that you put on your creatures. And that's the way to think about artifacts. There are many types of artifacts. You kind of throw them in when you can, or you build an artifact deck. There's certain play types and certain archetypes within artifact decks. You'll kind of see them as things go on, and they can do a lot of cool things, and I think they're actually a very fun card to work with, and generally they're broken. So just normal artifacts as we have here, like Inscribed Tablet, Joda's Codex, and Karn Silex, are just, you can think of them the same way as you think of enchantments, as in you pay 1 mana, 5 mana, or 3 mana, and they go on the battlefield, and they just sit there until you activate them. And as you can see, I'm not going to read all these, but they each have their own effect and own activated effect, right? So the first one, inscribed tablet, you pay 1, you tap it, you sacrifice inscribed tablet, which means it goes to your graveyard. You reveal the top 5 cards of your library, put a land card from among them into your hand. The rest go to the bottom of your library in a random order. If you didn't put a card in your hand this way, draw a card. That's what it does. It's a one-time use. Pay the 1 mana, goes on the battlefield. Then you can pay 1 mana and tap it to sacrifice it and use its ability. Right. And that is artifacts. Does that cover my list? Yes. So that is pretty much covers my Google Illustrator list that I came up with for this, just to give you guys a visual feedback of what Magic's kind of cards and archetypes work with. And with all that information now, there's one more card archetype we have to go over, and that are planeswalkers. Planeswalkers are very, very unique to the game. They basically augment the entire state of the board. There can be very powerful tools within your deck within the game, and we're going to be talking about them real quick. So lore wise, real quick, you yourself as a player are planeswalkers, but they also have characters in the game that kind of follow within the main story that are planeswalkers, and these people are allowed to jump between planes, different worlds, and they are very strong and unique within one sort of color pie generally. So the example of that I have is this card right here, which perfectly kind of demonstrates how planeswalkers work. So we have Jace, Indigenous Mind Mage. That's his name. We have that at 1. Okay? And then he costs 4 mana of any color and 2 blue, his mana cost. He's a legendary planeswalker, as it says right there, and his name is Jace. He is a Jace planeswalker. There are many types of Jace planeswalker. Jace is sort of the main character in Magic the Gathering. He has abilities, as you can see underneath his name. He also has a rarity. But before we go into abilities, we're going to talk about number 6 right here, which are loyalty counters. So loyalty counters are basically a planeswalker's health and resource system at the same time. It uses its health as its resources. If a loyalty counter reaches 0, they're dead. That's as simple as this. Planeswalkers can be attacked by creatures. That's the most efficient way to get rid of them. They can also be attacked by any spells that can target them, or any sort of special spells that just completely get rid of them as a whole. But the loyalty counter, number 6, is their resource / life system. So the first ability, number 4, +1, adds +1 to the loyalty counter. So if you play the planeswalker, you could use planeswalker's abilities immediately once per turn, unless said otherwise. So you play the planeswalker, you +1 it, you draw a card, its loyalty counter goes to 6. That's as simple as that. Or you use the second ability, you +1 it, it untaps all creatures you control. And generally, it has a +1, or maybe a -1 or -3, or -0, or just does nothing. And then it has an ultimate ability, which is the very last ability. So if you somehow get its loyalty counter to 9, you can cash it in, or you can keep going with it. And if you cash it in, it does its number 5 ability, which does here, gain control of up to 3 target creatures. So it just snatch your opponent's creature is its ultimate ability. We'll be going over this more. You'll see more planeswalkers once we get into game in a bit, right? So we have all that, right? We talked about planeswalkers, we talked about enchantments, we talked about sorceries, we talked about creatures. Those are all the pieces that you need to make a deck, right? So what is a deck? Well, before we go into decks, depend on what format you're playing in Magic the Gathering. So there's a couple different of formats that you may be interested. So think of formats as game modes, essentially. There are game modes within this card game. You have standard, which is your standard game mode. It is a 1v1 game mode. Decks consist of generally 60 cards. It can go over 60 cards, but it is recommended to have 60 cards. You have a 15 card sideboard. A sideboard is generally a extra set of cards that you can only use after a game is concluded to try and bring in other cards to augment your deck to counter the matchup or opponent's spells, right? And you can only have 4 cards of the same name in a deck. So it's 60 cards of 4 cards of the same name in the deck. This generally you run about maybe 20 lands in this. So 20 lands and 60 other archetypes of cards, whether that being creatures, enchantments, looking over some decks in a bit. The second format is draft. Draft is a little bit more loose. It's a little bit more fun. Basically, how you can draft is build decks of 40, so 40 card decks. You can go over this limit again, but is not recommended. 15, you have a sideboard of 15 cards, and again 4 cards of that name. Draft is a format unlike standard, where it is a 1v1. Draft, generally you buy each, you have a group of 4 people. You buy 3 packs each, and each person opens a pack, and you can take 1 card from that pack, and then you pass the rest of the pack to the next person, and you keep doing that until you guys are out of packs, and you build the deck of 40 cards. So you're just generally you're building your own deck in real time. You know, you don't have time to sit back and think about what cards you want. It's whatever's in that pack of cards is you take it, and you're gonna build your deck like that. That's draft. And then we have the really popular format, which is Commander / EDH / Brawl. And I've actually personally never really played this format, but this format is probably the most popular format in Magic of the next coming. And what is it? Well, you have 1 legendary creature. So any creature that has the legendary subtext on it is your commander. That is your big commander, your general card, right? And you have 100 cards, including your commander, in the deck. So it's a 100 card deck. All creatures in the deck must share the color identity of the commander. So if you have a commander that's only red, then every other card in your deck must be a red card. If you have a commander that's red-black, then every other card in your deck can be a red or black card. Except for artifacts. Of course, artifacts cheap. And you can only have 1 copy of a named card in your deck, which means if you have a Landworth Elf, you cannot have another one of that same name, except for lands. Lands do not apply to that. And Commander is generally a 4-player game, which means it is you versus 3 other players. So that is Commander. And these are the big formats that I would say. When it comes to Standard, which will be generally referred to as a constructed overall format, there's Standard, then there's Pioneer, which you can only use current cards and older cards going back to a specific set. There's Modern, which you can current cards going back to another older Pacific set. And then there's Legacy, and then there's Vintage. And basically what these formats mean is that you can use any card going forward up until a certain point. So Vintage, I think, is like the oldest format. You'll generally see a lot of those crazy, broken, just ridiculous decks because they can do whatever with some old cards that are not available for play in newer formats. In Standard, it's the most up-to-date format with the most newest cards that generally rotate out once a year. Draft is you build your own deck, and Commander is a big 100 card fest, right? So those are the formats that you can pick. So let's say we know what type of color we want. We have we know our creature types. We know how to build a deck. We know that we want to play standard, right? Well, we play standard. We have our opponent. We sit down. How do we play standard for the first time? Well, let's talk about turn order now. And as we're going into turn order, I just want to say that don't be scared. Like a lot of people, when you play Magic for the first time, are actually really nice. They will sit down, they will teach you the game, they will let you go at your own pace, and they'll kind of play easy with you. They won't bombard you like online games or if you play Magic. So I recommend that if you want to get into this game, if you want to play it for the first time, search up your local card game store. If there's generally Magic events on Friday, see if you can go there, talk to the community there, try and get into a draft if you can. That's probably a good way to start collecting cards and building up your deck and kind of learning deck building and the mechanics of the game, and just really just take it slow. So here we go. These are the phases of Magic, right? So we have our deck, we have an opponent, we play in the game. We roll our dice, we get to go first, right? The beginning phase. You have your untap phase, you have your upkeep phase, and you have your draw phase. So, in the untap phase, if we go to untap, the first part of every turn is your untap phase, where you untap all permanents you control. So if your permanents were tapped from the previous turn, you untap them. This will not really be applied in your first turn, but generally once the phase begins on your turn, then you will untap your creatures. Upkeep. Effects that ask you to pay or why I say pay or that pays you might happen here. I feel like that's basically any effect that says on your upkeep pay X or anything like that happens before your draw key or your draw step. This is when that triggers. So if I have an enchantment down that allows me spend 1 life or pay 1 life to draw a card at your upkeep, this triggers here at the upkeep phase. And then you have your draw step, which is as simple as you draw your card. So you draw your first card, right? So that's the first major step. Instant spells. Again, we talk about instants and how they can be played whenever within a step. Instants can be played here in this step. So before any of the untap things happen, if an ability or spell is allowed, and if it's an instant spell and you're allowed to play it at instant speed, you can play it here. So that's the first step. That's what happens after you roll your dice. You see who goes first. You draw your hand of 7 cards, and if you like the hand, then you keep the hand. If you don't, then you mulligan it. We'll talk about that a bit later. And then you play your land, and it's in its untap phase, right? That's what happens first. Then you have your pre-combat main phase. So in your pre-combat main phase, we just generally call this main phase. Play your land. You can play 1 land from your hand a turn, unless said otherwise. So you play your land. You then spend your mana. So let's say you have 2 red cards. You spend your mana to play a creature card. The creature that you summon that turn. So you summon it here in your main phase. It will have summoning sickness, attack, but it can block any abilities that happen on the creature. Trigger. You can also then play your sorceries, enchantments, planeswalkers, or artifacts the same way you play creatures. However, as you see with the last one, watch out for counterspells. Counterspells might be played here, so watch out. So these are counterspells are sort of instant type card. Instants can also be played during your main phase from your opponent. And if, let's say, you play a creature and your opponent doesn't like that and has a counterspell, they can play the counterspell and completely get rid of the creature before it resolves onto the battlefield, right? So all your kind of prep work happens at your main phase. Then you have your combat phase, and this is probably the most complicated of the phases. So if you look at combat phase, we have beginning of combat, declare attack, declare blockers, first strike damage, end of combat. So let's go over these steps. Let's read them. Beginning of combat. Combat begins. This step allows spells and effects while no longer in maining phase. So no sorcery speed effects can now be played. So you can't, any sorceries that you had can't be played. So you will then declare attackers. If it is your turn, select which creatures you want to attack with. So you select your creatures that you have that can attack, that were not summoned this turn. If they were summoned this turn, they have summoning sickness. So, but if they can attack, if they have haste, then you select which ones you want to attack with, right? Your opponent can then declare blockers. So if they have creatures that they want to block with, or they have instant spells known as tricks, like a lightning bolt or a removal spell, some sort of card that gets rid of your creatures, they can also play it pretty much any time within this phase. But they can play it here. This is probably the most likely place that they'll play it after you declare your attackers. So they can either play their instant cards or declare what creatures they want to block with. This goes into first strike and double strike damage. So if you have any creatures that have first strike or double strike, then those will trigger here, and that will do first strike damage, or that will do which means it will attack and the first, and then that creature will die, or it will attack again. If a creature does not have those effects, then it just goes in the damage phase, which means that it will now attack, blockers will block, and creatures will die or live or deal damage based off their results. And that's the end of combat phase. It is over, right? And then you go to your post-combat main phase. If you didn't play a land in your regular main phase, you can play one here. You can continue to spend the rest of your mana in your second main phase, and you can then play more sorceries or more instant spells here as well. So it is basically the same as main phase, unless you played a land. That's the only difference, right? Or you're out of mana. And then you end your turn. You have your end step, and you have your cleanup step. End of turn, generally you'll declare this to your opponent, and I end my turn. One last chance to play instant spells and effects before you end your turn. And cleanup many effects that last until end of turn. So effects that will say you have this ability until the end of turn will end here. And rinse and repeat. And that is turn order. That's how you play Magic the Gathering. I think it will become a lot more clear for you guys once we hop in game and we start playing. In fact, let me boot that up right now in case there's an update, because there may be a update. Yeah. Should have checked that before stream. That is my bad. And that's turn order. So I have it here, right? Who gets to go first in the start of it. Apparently it's decided by a dice roll. So who you roll dice, whoever gets the big number goes first. This can be declared in whatever way you want. With your opponent will just give, like, you can go first. Maybe you play rock paper scissors. It doesn't matter. It's up to whoever's playing. Hand size. So hand size within the game. When you start the game, you will start with 7 cards. So each player will draw 7 cards. Again, there are mechanics that bypass this. You can have more than 7 cards, but generally within the game, you can only have 7 cards in your hand when it's your turn. When it's your beginning step, if you have more than 7 cards, you're going to have to discard a card and get rid of it. So that's how it works. You have 7 cards. Mulligans. Do not like your hand for any reason. If the player does not like their hand, they can shuffle it back into their deck, draw a new hand of 7, and discard a card based on how many mulligans taken. So you get to put your hand back in your deck, draw a new hand, and then you have to get rid of 1 card because I took 1 mulligan. And you can do that for as many times as you want until you kind of run out of cards or mulligans or anything like that in general. So that's mulligan. Summoning Sickness. I spelled summoning wrong. Summoning Sickness. Cards such as creatures cannot attack on the turn they are put into play. Unless they have haste, haste bypass this rules. They can still block. Talked about that. Tapped. Tapping a permanent can be used until next untap phase. So tapping a permanent, let's say I have my phone here, I play it. Tapping it is I just generally that it just sticks in the battlefield like that, and they untap on your phase. And then legendary rule. Creatures with the subtext legendary, you can only have one legendary creature on the battlefield, or one legendary card on the battlefield. So if you have 2 legendary cards, you have to get rid of one on the battlefield. That's how that works. So that is gameplay, right? That's pretty much how everything works in Magic the Gathering. Take a quick break here. All right, yes, logged in. Pretty sure there's a new set here, so perfect timing on me on doing this, right? But that is how everything works. That's how the game works. That is Magic the Gathering, right? We talked about creatures, we talked about mana, we talked about decks, we talked about formats, and we talked about how to play the game. So next, what are we going to discuss? Graveyards. Graveyards are exactly what you think about. If you ever watch the Yu-Gi-Oh anime, I send my creature to the graveyard. That's what it is. A graveyard, what goes in the graveyard? Well, discard cards go in the graveyard. Mill cards, sort of archetype of deck, which means when a player just takes cards from your library to your graveyard, it goes into your graveyard. If the creature dies, it goes into your graveyard. If the planeswalker dies, it goes into your graveyard. And if it's a removal effect or it has a keyword saying destroy target creature for X, or send target creature to the graveyard, it goes to the graveyard. The graveyard is interactable. There are cards that interact with the graveyard. You can bring cards back from the graveyard. You can build a graveyard deck. One of my favorite decks of this is the Hogak deck. Completely busted deck, and it is a graveyard deck. That means there are also cards that hate on the graveyard. The exile zone. Permanents that are exiled cannot be interacted with and cannot return to the player's hand or to play, unless stated by the card, such as Leyline Binding. So Leyline Binding is an example of an enchantment. It is a removal enchantment. It can be flashed in. When Leyline Binding enters the battlefield, exile target non-land permanent and opponent controls unless Leyline Binding leaves the battlefield. So when it leaves, then the exile card comes back. But generally, cards that get exiled do not come back. The exile zone cannot be interacted with. It is gone for the rest of the game. Right. Last thing is the stack. The stack is something you kind of learn as you play the game, I would say more. It is basically order of operations of the game. It's how things work. So we've kind of talked about it as things gone on, but let's say you play a creature, your opponent plays a counter spell. You play a counter spell to counter that counter spell. Your opponent doesn't have anything left, right? So what's the order of operations here? Well, the stack is going to resolve your counter spell to counter that counter spell, which means that your opponent's counter spell does not activate, and then it plays your creature. So it's really just the order of operations within the game. We'll see it a lot more when we get into the game. And that pretty much covers gameplay. That's it. Like that, you now can go out and play Magic the Gathering. If you have the cards, you can play Magic the Gathering. That covers it. Took an hour, but yeah, that pretty much covers Magic the Gathering. And now we're gonna get into deck types. We're gonna start playing the game. We're gonna go over some more cards, examples of the game, just so you can understand how everything interacts with each other and how you play the game overall. So deck types. We have these are the main deck types, really, and there are 1,000 different types of deck types. But these are the main ones that I think you should go to when you're first making a game, or when you're first playing the game and you're thinking about making it. So you have aggro decks. Aggro decks are fast, aggressive decks. Generally, the most popular one is mono red, which is just the red aggro deck. Uh, it is very fast. It is the goal of the deck is to kill the player with small creatures, haste them in, and just kill them as fast as possible. We have mid-range decks, which are mostly creatures. These kind of turn on mid-game rather than early game. They play big creatures like 4/4s and 5/5 creatures, and they're more mid-range, mid-game oriented. We have combo decks. Combo decks are known for doing some sort of crazy combo card. So you get card X and you get card Y, and card X triggers card Y to fetch card Z, and card Z wins the game. These are combo decks. Generally, some sort of uh, multiple pieces within the deck that allow you to win the game. And then you have control decks. These are my kind of favorite archetypes of decks. They win by slowing the game down and generally playing big sort of creatures. So control decks control the pacing of the games. These are more end game deck oriented. The goal of this deck is to get to the end of the game to play your big payoffs. So they generally play a lot of counter spells, a lot of card draw. They're generally in the colors of blue. They have generally one big payoff, one big creature. They play a lot of planeswalkers, and these are control decks. So think of one as an early game deck, it's aggro. Mid game deck is mid, and control and combo decks can be end, or combo decks can fit in any sort of state of the game, and control decks are generally end game. And then I wrote down some kind of subcategory decks that you may like to play. So life gain decks, these are decks that are really big on gaining life to get your life total up to 100 plus. Ramp decks, they are decks that are, the goal of it is to play a lot of lands and to cheat a lot of lands in play, because remember, you play one land per turn unless stated otherwise. Then you can play multiple lands a turn, and you're trying to play a lot of lands in order to a lot of mana in order to play really big creatures or payoffs. So those are ramp decks. And then the last one is burn decks, which are generally they play spells to attack your player directly. And then card rarity. We already talked about card rarity. So if you want to learn the game, watch the game's content, or look at some decks, I think the best place to look at and the best site that makes really good content for Magic the Gathering is MTG Goldfish. They have a site, they have a YouTube channel, they talk about Commander, they talk about so many sorts of aspects of the game, so many different formats of the game, and they make a lot of really cool decks. They have budget decks, so they have series that are really good for making cheap decks. So if you want to get in the game, here's a $52 deck that you can play and be semi-competitive with, right? So you don't have to go big end and pay $500 for these big decks. They have really cheap decks. Actually, one of my favorite decks is a wizard deck, where the goal is get a certain card. I forget the name of the card right now. I think it's called a Bond or something like that. And basically, what it does is any wizard that enters the battlefield, its ability triggers twice. And that is the goal of the deck, is to play this one card, play my wizards, and kind of lock the opponent out of the game because all the abilities trigger twice. So let's look at some of these decks, right? We gave examples. We're going to look at Azorius Control. That will be our control deck. Esper Midrange will be our mid-range deck. Mono Red Aggro will be our aggro deck. And do they have any combo decks kind of right now in standard? I don't think they do, but generally you will see a lot of combo decks in older formats. So I want to say, I think Fire. here's a ramp deck. We'll grab that, and I think that will be kind of a good example for a combo deck. I want a better example of a combo deck for you guys, just because it'll be easier to explain. I'm gonna try that. All right. So here is our control deck. This is our basic control deck. If you're thinking of making a control deck, here we go. How do you win with this game, with this deck? Okay, so it has 25 lands, a sideboard 15, 3 creatures, 5 planeswalkers, 17 spells, 7 artifacts, 3 enchantments. As you can see, it runs a multitude of lands. It runs 5 planes, we already know that, 4 islands, and then we'll run a different types of dual lands. So this example, this is my pain land that I was talking about earlier, where it adds 1 mana of 1 colorless mana, and if you want to add a mana of white or blue, then it will deal 1 damage to you. So that is a pain land. That is a good example of pain land. And these lands, these legendary lands, are a good example of utility lands where you can pay a certain amount of mana and it will do some sort of special thing. So you kind of want to, this is like kind of how decks get expensive, is the lands, but you kind of want to think about how you're building your deck and what type of lands are good and what type of lands you can use, right? You have 3 creatures, which are fairly expensive. So Urza, Lord of Protector, is a very new card. He is a creature that has the ability to become a planeswalker. But to activate his ability to become a planeswalker, you need to have both an Urza Lord Protector on the battlefield and a Might Stone of the Weak Stone, I believe. And you need to pay 7 mana to get him to transform. So he's generally weak. If you just play him by himself, he's really weak, right? But when you get the pieces, he becomes strong. He's a late game card. So how do we get there? Same with Cityscape Level. We run 2 of these. It is 8 mana. That is extremely expensive. How do we get there? But when we get this card on the field, it's an 8/8, so it has huge stats. It has trample, which means that it attacks through creatures, right? So excess damage goes through creatures if it gets blocked. And whenever you cast a spell, and whenever Cityscape Leveler attacks, destroy up to 1 target non-land permanent it controls a creature and tap Power Stone token. So it straight up removes opponent's creature or non-land permanents whenever it's played or attacked. So so these are your really big playoffs, right? And then you have some other payoffs. You have Tezit, Betrayer of the Flesh. You have the Wandering Emperor, and you have Teferi, Temporal Pilgrim, right? But your big playoffs are Urza and Cityscape Leveler. Those are the cards that are going to win you the game. So how do we get there, right? Well, we have to have cards that protect us, cards that make us safe, cards that just let us kind of get to that point in the game. So Fateful Mending, what does this do? I'm going to kind of speed run through this now because I want to go over the other decks too. Fateful Mending, it gives me 2 life, it draws a card. Cool. Thirst of Knowledge, draws 3 cards, discard 2 cards. Cool, draws me cards. Depopulate. Each player who controls a multicolor creature draws a card, then destroys all creatures. So this is what we refer to as a board wipe. What it does is it clears the board. It gets rid of every card that is on the battlefield. It gets rid of it. So again, slows down the game. Your opponent will have to restart, and you get to a break. It's a get out of jail kind of free card. Invoke Justice. Return target permanent card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Then dispute 4 1/1 counters among any number of creatures or vehicle targets. So this is another big payoff. What it does is it brings your cards. So if you have Cityscape Leveler in the graveyard, it now brings it to the battlefield. It will then add 4 1/1 counters to it. So this 8/8 now becomes a 12/12, right? If my math's right, and it another big payoff, right? And then repair and recharge, return target artifact, creature, or planeswalker card from each graveyard to the battlefield. So all these spells are meant to either engage your playoff or your payoffs, or keep you alive or let you draw more cards. You have artifacts. You have have Bank Buster. This card is a very famous card. It lets you draw more cards. It is also a creature. It's a vehicle. Might Stone the Weak Stone. It lets you draw a card or make a creature get -5/5. It also adds mana, and you need this card in order to flip Urza, right? Portal for Phyrexia, another huge payoff. What it does is it lets you reanimate or sacrifice your opponent's creatures, so they have to die, and then it lets you bring in any creature from any graveyard. It lets you reanimate it. And then one with the multiverse again. It lets you may look at the top card of your library at any time. You may play a land and cast spells from the top card of your library. Once during each turn, you may cast a spell from your hand or from the top of your library without paying its mana cost. So another huge payoff. It lets you see what your next card you're going to draw is, and it lets you play that for free once per turn. So as you can see, there's a whole bunch of big payoffs in the control deck, and there's a whole bunch of things to protect you to reach to those to get to those payoffs. And that's how control decks work, right? You have really big creatures, really big effects that just let you win the game on the spot, and you're trying to get there without dying. Let's talk about aggro decks next. Aggro decks, the opposite of control decks. They're generally cheap. They're generally very good starting decks for people who want to start playing the game. I would start with aggro decks, and generally aggro, mono red aggro is the starting red deck. So you very different from what we just saw with our control deck. We have 21 creatures, 21 lands, 4 planeswalkers, 10 spells, and 4 enchantments. So a lot more creatures. And if you see what the theme with these creatures, they're very cheap in its mana cost, and they all are generally very low stat. So it's their 2 health, 2 attack, right? 2/2s, right? But they will generally all have haste, as we can see with a lot of these creatures. They have haste, and they will have abilities that will allow them to grow and get bigger. And then red decks will have cards like Lightning Strike, which is kind of their removal or attack cards in their face. And we have cards that will just remove other creatures or make your cards a lot stronger. So red decks are mono red aggro is exactly what I said it was. Small creatures, fast, beat them down. You want to beat the opponent down, get them down to 0 health as fast as possible. That is the goal of decks. That's why I recommend starting with these decks, because they're very simple, they're very easy to play, they're very cheap as well, and they let you just kind of learn the game before you branch off into archetypes. Early game decks. Mid-range. So mid-range decks are a little bit different. As you can see, they're kind of now in the middle of the game, right? They have 16 creatures, so less than aggro, but more than control. They run 4 planeswalkers, or they can run 4 planeswalkers, at least this deck list does. They add spells, so they have some counter spells to kind of slow down the early game. They have removal spells to, remove creatures. And then they have card draw spells as well, and they run 25 lands. So the entire point of this game is to play a lot of your creatures, beat them down, and win in the middle of the game. So you'll have creatures that are really good early game, you'll have creatures that are very good late game, and you'll have creatures that are very good mid game. Those are mid-range decks. Ramp decks. So this is like the one side one that I'll go over because it also has a lot of combo potential in this deck. This deck is pretty good if you want to go into this format, which is Pioneer, and it is to get as much mana as possible in order to play big creatures and win the game. How does it do that? Well, it does that with this card, which is Nithos. Basically, what Nithos does is you pay 2 mana, and for each mana symbol devotion that you have, you get more mana of that. So that is why every card you can see is green, and for each green symbol you get extra mana, right? And you basically want to play Nithos, play your green spells, your Elvish Mystics on turn 1. This gets you more mana. Its green symbol goes to Mythos, and it just kind of doubles and triples your mana. A lot of the early game creatures, the Elvish Mystic and Landwar Elf, are mana dorks. They add 1 mana, right? Love Struck Beast is kind of more of a defense card to protect you, while same with Old Growth Troll is protect you and play defense and off text. Cavalier of Thorns is kind of your big like payoff creature to refuel and protect you, and you do that because the goal of the deck is to get to one of your big payoffs, which is Karn the Great Creator. Karn the Great Creator allows you to get a card from your sideboard, and you get a card from your sideboard in order to grab one of your even bigger tools or bigger payoffs that are in the sideboard, like Cityscape Leveler, like God Pharaoh Statue, like Sovereign Cruiser Flagship, in order to play those and win the game. So you are ramping up, getting as much. Oath of Nissa also helps you get lands and cheat lands in play. You're trying to get as much mana as possible, as fast as possible, in order to pay, or in order to play your really big payoffs or any spells that you may need to counter your opponent's deck. That's kind of common. Simic, let's see. This is the deck that I picked for the combo deck. As I was hoping. As you can see, it's all in green. As you can see, it's kind of doing the same thing that the last deck was doing. It's trying to ramp into green to get Karn of the Great Creator in order to get one of its big payoffs in the sideboard. That is, again, it's win condition. That's the combo. It also has Collective Company. Collective Company is a special kind of card you'll see in like aggro mid-range decks that allows you to grab cards that are 3 mana or less and put 3 of them onto the battlefield. So that's why all the creatures, as you can see, don't go over 3 mana, because Collective Company will grab those creatures and put them in. This is actually an elf deck. Why did I even pick this one? But this is also a good example of a tribal deck where they are all elves. Every single creature is an elf. Every single card that is pretty much in the game will be able to benefit for elves. So it's even abusing Nithos again, funny enough. So that's an example of that, right? That pretty much goes over deck building. I'm going to do this last. And now we're going to get into the game. So this is Magic the Gathering Arena. This is probably the best and easiest way to get into Magic the Gathering right now. There's also Magic the Gathering Online, which allows you to play older formats as well. But these are the cards that I got because I believe I haven't played in a minute, and the new set just dropped as well. So perfect timing for that. So let's start with what you would do if you started the game, right? Which is opening some decks or opening some packs. If I have any. Okay, good. Yeah, give me some. So anyway, so we're opening some packs. And I have 3 Phyrexia, all will be 1 packs, right? And this is what you'll do. You'll buy your first pack, right? And you will open it. And it will give you your cards, right? For here, right here, it gave me, as you can see, a lot of uncommons. You'll get a lot of uncommons. You'll get 2 commons, which are these silver bordered cards. I got a common wild card, which will allow me to spend that, and in the concept of arena, will allow me to spend this wild card in order to unlock other cards that I may not have. And then I will get generally 1 rare, which in this case is a land. Alright, so let's just open my other decks for the hell of it. Gave me another land. This is dual land, as we can see. Copperline Gorge. Copperline Gorge, when entering the battlefield, tapped unless you control 2 or fewer lands. So it will become tapped unless I control 1 or 2 or fewer lands. Me says it right there. We'll open our last pack. And I got a rare wild card, which will let me get a rare card. So we have our cards, right? We go to deck. Generally, this Magic Arena will have starter decks for you, so you don't have to worry about building your own deck at first. You'll be able to do a little bit of research and then figure out what deck you want to build yourself. But here it is. Here's your starter deck right here. So starter deck, cool. I pick one. For our case, because it's the only deck I have, we're just gonna stick with Gruul Aggro. These are all the cards I need for Gruul Aggro. So let's explain this deck. It is a aggro deck. It is generally an old aggro deck. You probably won't run into this too much. It is also only legal in, I believe, the historic format. This is a very unique deck, but that's why I picked it, because I want you guys to start seeing the habit of how different decks do. So it's an aggro deck, right? So aggro means it's supposed to win very early. So the goal of this deck is to haste every creature into play. So I have Land War Elves that I can play on turn 1 to kind of get my mana going, so I can then play a 3 mana card on turn 2, for example. I have Pelt Collector, which is a recursive threat, meaning grows for each creature with bigger power and toughness I have on it. So it just grows and gets bigger. I play this on turn 1. Then on turn 2, if I play a 2/2, it gets stronger. It becomes a 2/2, and it just keeps on kind of snowballing up. Then I have Scavenging Ooze. Scavenging Ooze is really to help me hate on graveyards. So if a lot of opponents are playing a lot of graveyard cards, Scavenging Ooze can eat those cards. It gives me life, and it also grows as a threat. Burning Tree Embassy gives me more mana when it gets into play, so it allows me to then play other cards along with this card. It's essentially a free spell because it costs, as you can see, either 2 red or 2 green, or vice versa. And when it enters the battlefield, it gives me it gives me a red and it gives me a green mana. So it's a free spell. It pays for itself. And then everything else, same thing. Baltic Brawl allows me to, it's another spell that comes in that can get very big. Shatter Skull Summit is a land, but it also works as a removal spell, so I can get rid of creatures and things like that. It's also a land. Most of my big creatures have haste on it, so Akrop Crusher has haste, it attacks immediately. Bone Crusher Giant works as removal, works as damage to my opponent. It's also a pretty big threat. Voodoo Mammoth is either a land or it's another threat that gets bigger. Gruul Spellbreaker is kind of the main card of this deck. It can either have haste and it gets bigger, or it has haste. It can either have haste and attack immediately, or it can become a 4/4 and get bigger. Questing Beast, completely broken card. It has Vigilance on it, which means it never taps. It has Death Touch on it, which means whatever touches it dies immediately. It has Haste on it, which means it attacks immediately. You can all read these on the screen, right? Questing beats cannot be blocked by creatures with 2 power or less. So if it has 2 power or less, it can't be blocked. And whenever it deals combat damage to anything, it also deals that to planeswalkers as well. And then Ember Cleave is my big payoff. So I can flash it in, right? It's otherwise fairly expensive. It is an equipment card. Whenever this spell costs 1 less for each creature that is attacking. So whenever I have creatures attacking, I can play this card, and then it pretty much doubles its attack. It also adds first strike and trample, as we can see. And then I just have my lands. Nothing special here. Just a couple dual lands and normal lands, right? So I built my deck. We hit the play button. I'm going to play those are events. We're gonna play bot. And we're gonna pick the Gruul deck. Right? Because I just explained that deck to you. So here we go. We are starting the game against a bot. We have a hand. This has 3 mana in it. Or actually has two lands. Burning Tree Emissary, so that's a free card. It also has some aggro to some creatures to attack, and it has my big payoff. So to me, this is actually a very decent hand. The only problem is that these lands are shock lands, which means if I play them, I'm going to take, and I pay the 2 life, I'm going to take 2 damage. Otherwise, they're going to come in untapped. If I didn't like this hand, I would mulligan it. But I'm going to keep this hand for this example because I think it is actually a very good hand to start off the game, right? So I'm going to keep it. The bot went first. He played his 1 land card. Let me check real quick if I have audio on. Alright, I do have audio on. That should be picking up now. And what's my first play, right? So my first play, again, is my turn. The bot went first. I go second. I draw a card. So I have now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 cards in hand because I went second. So it was my draw step. So I got to draw a card. And I'm going to play 1 land. Now, because it is my first turn, I'm in no rush. I'm going to play it tapped. And I'm not going to spend any mana. So now it is my opponent's turn. He has 2 mana. He plays a Woodland Mystic, which is a creature that what it does is it has Summoning Sickness right now, so it can't tap. But when it does, it will tap for 1 green mana. So now he has 3 green mana, and I only have 1 mana. But I just drew a card. So, what's my play here? I drew a Forest card. Now, I can go and play the Stomping Grounds, but if I play the Stomping Grounds, I would have to either pay 2 life to come in untapped, or not pay it and come in tapped. If I tapped, too slow. I'm an aggro deck. If I pay 2 life, that's fine, but I lose 2 life. And I have a free land card, which basically does all of it, and mana-wise, I'm okay, right? So we're going to play this. Then we're going to go Burning Tree Embassy, because it is a free card. Paid for itself, it gave us 2 mana, right? So now we have 2 options. We can Bone Crusher Giant, and we can use its Stomp ability to stomp this creature to slow it down, as we have 2 Bone Crusher Giants. Or we can play Volcanic Brawl to have another creature on the field for next turn. So I'm actually going to use the Stomp ability to slow him down. So now he's back to 2 mana, and I'm back to, and now it's a little bit even, and I have a creature on the play. So he plays a 2/2, right? Instead of now that would play a 4/4, that would kind of hinder what I was doing before. And now we're in an even play field. Now who knows that if the move I did last turn was correct or not? That, you know, who knows? I could have again played this card instead. But then there's the threat of, because he would have had 4 mana up last turn, he could have played a bigger creature, right? So that's kind of how the game interacts. That's how things go. Who knows? So what we're going to do is we're going to play our land. I'm actually going to pay the 2 life here. So now I have 3 mana, but I lost 2 life. So now I'm down to 18 life. He's still at 20. And what we're going to do is we're going to play the Bone Crusher Giant. Have a big card on the field, bigger than his, and that is a bigger threat. Now, we're in our attack phase. We can choose to attack, which in this case, if we do, he may block the creature, or he may just take the hit. If I was in his case, I'll probably, depending on what hand I have, I don't know the hand, I may just take the hit, or I may block to trade the creatures. So to make it spicy, let's just attack. Let's see what happens. Okay, so the bot blocked. So both of our creatures die. They go in his graveyard. It goes in my graveyard, which my camera is blocking my graveyard right now, but it's basically adjacent to hit. Next, so what did we draw? We drew another Burning Tree Emissary, and he played a 4/4 at 5 mana. So it's just a 4/4. It doesn't have any abilities. That's just subtext. So what are we gonna do? Well, let's play our Burning Tree Emissary, the free spell, right? And then we can, probably the best thing is to either play our Crop Crusher or our Volcanic Brawler. So let's just play our Volcanic Brawler. His abilities are going to activate. Now we can swing into trade with him, which again, we are an aggro deck. It's kind of what we want to do. Or we can not attack. And I'm going to swing again. Who knows if this is the right move or not. He's going to trade. I feel like the bot's always going to trade. But that's the best move. So we drew a land here. So this is good. So we have... He drew a spider, which has vigilance, which means it does not tap after attacking. And it's a 4/4. And our creatures are relatively small compared to his, right? But remember, our big playoff is Embercleave. So Embercleave costs 1 less for each attacking creature. So technically, if we attack with both these creatures, instead of costing 4, it will cost 2. So this is now a 4 mana spell. And we have 4 mana. So what we can do here, because remember we're an aggro deck and Embercleave is our big payoff, and we have 2 red mana, is we're going to attack. Alright? We're going to pay, because that's going to make it bigger. And then here, if I'm doing this correctly, we're going to go to our blocking phase. It's going to block that. So what we're going to do is now we're going to play Embercleave, big blowout, and we're going to select our Burning Tree Emissary. That lets it live. Oh, it didn't let it live, but it killed the creature, and it took a ton of damage, right? That was huge. So now we're in a much better position than we were before. We get land. At this point, we're just playing our land to whatever color we need. We're going to equip our Embercleave, making that a bigger creature. And then we are going to shock the cat, because we can. And he's going to take 4 damage to the face. 5, because we leveled up. Twice, because of Embercleave. He only has 4 health left. We are at 18. We are winning. Right. So, at this point in the game, unless he has some sort of secret type of card, he's probably dead. So what we're going to do is we're going to play Pelt Collector. Then we are going to play our Crop Crusher finally, because it has haste. Now Crop Crusher, you may exert Crop Crusher as it attacks. When you do, target creature can't block this turn. So we are going to exert it, and we are going to attack with our Embercleave equipped Volcanic Brawler. We're going to attack, and this is what I was talking about with the stack. So the stack here is which ability will trigger first, and I get to decide. So obviously I kind of want, it doesn't matter in this case, but that's a good example of it. So we're going to make that creature unblockable, so it can't block this turn, and he is dead. And that's magic. The bot is very dumb, of course. It's very easy to beat, but that is how the game essentially works. So let's play a game against a real player. Alright. I'm not going to talk as much. We're going to see how this goes. We're going to see what we draw. And we're going to see how the player kind of, now that we're going against a real player, how they interact with us and how we interact with them. What type of deck they're playing versus what type of deck we're playing. Last deck, the bot was playing a mono green deck. A very low budget looking deck. Wasn't that great. And as you can see, we kind of outplayed them. So here we go. We have our hand. So our hand is, it's okay. I don't think I'm gonna keep this. It has 3 lands in it. 1 creature. We want more creatures. It has our Ember Cleave, which is good, and has our Scavenging Oozes, but we don't really know if we need Scavenging Oozes or not, and it's not really the type of threat that we want. Sadly, our player won the dice roll, so our opponent won the dice roll, so they get to go first, and we have to go second. So we're gonna mulligan. This gives us 2 lands. Oh boy, I think we're about to get magicked. Probably may be really good. 2 lands, a Bone Crusher, a Gruul Spellbreaker, and a Scavenging Ooze. So I'm actually gonna keep this. I think it'll be okay. There's a lot of things that are now stacked against us as we mulliganed, and they go first. So we're gonna keep this. We have to discard a card. We're gonna get rid of the Questing Beast. And now it's our opponent's turn. They go first. They play a land. We're gonna play our Smashing Coals Summit as a land. We are not going to pay 3. Alright, so this dude's playing a mill deck. So his entire gameplay is to mill our cards into our graveyard, right? So we don't have any cards left. So he gets to look at our hand. He has to discard a card. Sadly, he got rid of our land card. We kind of needed that. Luckily, we draw an extra land. We're going to have haste. And now we're going to beat him down. Aggro decks don't need a whole lot of lands. They do want a bit, but they don't need a whole lot. As you can see, because he looked at our hand, they have the eyeballs at the bottom, so he sees our hand. He knows what we have. Previously, he won't know what we'll have next. The Meat Hook Massacre. That gets rid of the board wipe spell. Kind of dumb. That gets rid of our Scavenging Ooze. Gonna haste another creature. We're just gonna keep beating him down. That's our goal, right? We're an aggro deck. Beat, 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 beat down. Damage, damage, damage. He's more of a slow-paced control type of deck, so we kind of beat him out. And you can see, like, he's kind of taking it slow, thinking about his moves. He doesn't know what to do next. So unless he has some sort of removal, which he did, he got rid of our Scavenging Ooze. We kill him, I think, probably next turn, actually. Alright, so he has Ashiok, he has a planeswalker, he's
I
gonna bounce one of our
wonder
creatures.
if you're brave enough to overcome. Terror lurks among us.
Yeah. Huh. So I don't really care about exiling my library. So what I'm gonna do, and I don't really care about the Ashiok too much, because if I get damage, I can just stomp him for 2. So if he blocks that, that's fine. Alright, Memory Deluge, he's gonna get some cards. Unless he finds an answer, he's dead.
Creeping, thieving.
Yeah, alright, he died. So, we won our game. And that's how you play Magic. So, he was going a very slow, control-y type of deck, and we were doing a very fast-paced, aggro sort of deck. And we completely stomped him, right? And now we're kind of ending the stream, we're ending the breakdown videos. I've gone over everything. I've gone over a lot of things you want to go over. We can look at decks. We can look at collections. There are many sorts of cards, types of cards that you can go for, and there's so many options in this game that you can build for, so many different types of decks that you can build for. There are so many different colors. There are now, I believe, a lot more sets on Arena than before, and you just have so many options to play the game. So this is the new current set that just dropped, I believe today, or it releases February 10th. So it's out on Arena, but it comes out Friday. So perfect. If you want to get into Magic right now, Friday is your day to go to. Find your local game store and just show up for the launch event. Generally you have to pay, I think, like $35 to get in, and you may have to do it online. But this is how I got into Magic, and I think this is the best way. So these are all the cards for the new set. These are the special art cards, the Phyrexian versions of the cards. As that's why there's double versions of it. Read it over, go over some really cool stuff, really strong stuff. As you can see, here's your planeswalker. That it has its abilities. It has a passive ability. It has its name. It has its cost. And we have our artifacts. We have our sorceries, and we just have so many different types of cards and combos and new things to explore. The big payoff, the card that I think a lot of people are excited for, is, I think, Elish Norn. Not seeing her. It's this one. Is it that one? Oh yeah, here she is. Elish Norn, Vigilance. If permanents enter the battlefield, cause it to trigger a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger that ability. Triggers additional time, so trigger abilities to happen twice. And permanents entering the battlefield don't cause abilities of permanents your opponents cause to trigger. So your opponent's abilities don't trigger. And this is the big kind of staple card that a lot of people are excited to build around, including me. I may even get back into Magic just to play with this card. So now, new set, new content is probably the best way to play. Anyway, that's it. That's Magic the Gathering. I hope you guys liked it. I know this was a super long stream, but that was kind of the point of the format. I thought streaming was a good format to talk about these types of videos, to talk about game design, to talk about how the games interact with each other. There are tons and tons of mechanics that I did not go over, interactions that I did not go over, decks that you can build, things that are really fun. I recommend you check out content creators like MTT Goldfish to find some of those really cool and fun combo decks. I hope you enjoyed this breakdown. If you are a new player, I hope it helped you learn the game. Um, if you are a designer, I hope you understand kind of how tempo and archetypes and resource management and why this game, I think as designers need to know Magic the Gathering. It is by far, I think, mechanically the most complex game ever made, and I think that's why every game designer needs to play it to understand how things interact with each other. Um, and that's pretty much it. Anyway, this has been your host, Salty Waffles, signing off. And before I say my end line, make sure to leave a like, comment, subscribe. Forgot that. Really helps me out. Comments as well really helps me out. I would love to maybe talk about next breakdown videos, anything like that, or more entertainment styled videos, anything like that. So now, this has been your host, Salty Waffles, signing off, and I hope you're having a wonderful